So one night I was visiting the doctor with my brother John, and we decided to stop and see a movie on the way home, and it was a thunderstorm. And we were late, and we came home and found my mother dead. She had a very bad heart as a result of rheumatic fever, and she just died very very suddenly. And we walked in, and she was there, sitting in the Victorian chair, which is in the back room here at 2410 Eunice, and it was a terrible shock. And I lost 10 pounds just overnight, and the doctor was very worried that I might lose the baby, but he actually came to the house. Doctors did things like that in those days. He came to the house to be sure that I was all right, and told me how to take care of myself. And so my oldest brother, made all the preparations for the funeral and took the body up to where my father had been buried in the Interlaken area. And from then on, I was on my own and knew I was going to be having a baby, and knew that Jeb would not be there, my mother would not be there, and my brother, younger brother John, was going to, he was joining the Navy, because everybody was going into the service at that point, and he was going to be assigned to a ship that was going to the Mediterranean area. So I rented a small house, and I had lots of furniture because my mother had all this furniture that had been in storage from the second marriage, and it's most of the things that we have now sitting here, this tables and the chairs and so on, that were I had been in storage, and they automatically came to me because nobody else wanted them. And so I figured, well, I better have a house to put them in and make a home. And since I'm going to have a baby. So I fixed this little house up very nice. And that was a mistake, because the woman who had rented it to me had gone to Bridgeport. Her husband was in war work. See, everybody was moving around constantly to wherever they could get the most money for the, work and jobs. And it seemed like the whole United States was either moving west or coming east or going somewhere within the area. They were, there was no stability, it seemed like. But anyway, she saw how I'd fixed this house up, and it was her house, and she didn't like it. And so she gave me notice, a month's notice, that I had to be out. In other words, she evicted me. And so luckily I found another place that was actually better. It was closer into where the stores were, and Jeb's cousin, Baron, his wife, he was in the European theater in the Army fighting, and she was going to have a baby almost the same time Nancy was due. So we rented this upstairs and downstairs of this house, and it was owned by a dentist who lived up in the back, and they thought it was so cute having an Army wife and a Navy wife who were both pregnant living in their house, and they could watch us every day and see how we were doing. And the two babies were born there, and we became very fast friends. And so Jeb was at sea and didn't even see his new baby. In fact, he didn't even know whether it was a he or she. His mother had sent him a telegram that reached him, some kind of a airmail, something, that said, congratulations on your offspring. And she didn't even say it was a girl. Well, she didn't want a girl. The last thing in the world she wanted was a girl. And she didn't like the name Nancy, so there was nothing happy with her about the birth of Nancy. And of course, every time she picked Nancy up, Nancy would scream, bloody murder. So anyway, he finally got a notice through the Red Cross again that he had a daughter named Nancy Louise. And, he thought that was wonderful. I just got through from where Nancy was born, right?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, and redundancy, yeah.
The master's gonna fix this up.
Yeah, that's not good. Usually stop.
Well, we've covered the birth of Nancy Louise Rechen, born in Mount Kisco, New York, on August 12th, exactly the day the doctor in Quincy, Massachusetts said she would be born. A very healthy baby. And we cut her hair and sent it to her father. And he was very happy to have a daughter. He did not see her until she was 1 year old, when he had some leave and came back to New York State. And he was determined he would teach her how to walk while he was home on this 1 week leave. And he did. Mission accomplished. He then returned to the West Coast. And in a short time, the ship went out, and then the ship came back, and he said, I get a phone call in the middle of the night. Oh, wouldn't you come out? Maybe you can find someone to take care of Nancy. We can meet in San Francisco. We were always meeting in San Francisco. So I said, okay, I have a friend who has a baby the same age, and I think she'll take care of Nancy, and I'll come. So I did. And when I came back after about 3 weeks, I guess, it seemed like an eternity, being away from my little darling, she didn't care a thing about me. She was calling the other woman Mommy, and I thought I'd never win her back, but finally I did. So then he still hadn't seen her. Oh no, he did. Pardon me. This is going to have to be edited out because I'm getting all confused here, because he had already taught her to walk.
Oh, yeah.
So, well, the next urgent message we got from the West Coast was, my ship is coming in, and it's going to be in dry dock for an extended period, and I'm able to get a Quonset hut, and you and Nancy should come out, and you should put all the things in storage, and we'll have a glorious life at Mare Island, California. So I told my cousins what my husband was asking me, and they said, insane. Any man who would ask you to do something like that when you have this lovely home here and go and live in a Quonset hut is a beast. You shouldn't even consider it. So I walked the street the whole night. I got Nancy asleep and decided I would think this thing through. And so I walked the street all night long. And by morning, I decided that I was going to go. That this meant more to me and our marriage and our future and everything. So I went into action, sold quite a bit of furniture, left a bunch of stuff on the back porch with a big sign, free, on it. And people came and picked it up. Contacted a storage company and packed a small trunk, very small, to take things to to Mare Island. Believe me, it was a little. I insisted on having a toaster for one thing. I figured we couldn't live without a toaster, and an iron frying pan, and the rest of it was mostly just clothes and things for the baby. So a friend drove me down to LaGuardia, and we took off on United Airlines and arrived in San Francisco, and Jeb was there to meet us with his friend and a borrowed Jeep. And Nancy was absolutely delighted. She had charmed everyone all the way out on the airplane and been held by many different men during the trip. I hardly had to take care of it all. She was such a cute little charmer that everybody wanted to be near her and love her and take care of her. And so she never seemed to mind at all missing her home and her furniture. She loved the Quonset hut, and she loved being around all the men. And anyone was good enough because she would see any naval officer and she'd call them all daddy. She wasn't sure who her father was anyway. But the most embarrassing time was one time when she walked up to an admiral and hugged his leg and looked up at him, and he said, "Whose child is this?" It turns out he was a bachelor admiral, and he didn't appreciate being called daddy by someone's little blonde-haired child. Anyway, we had glorious, glorious times in the Quonset hut, and that's when we began to realize that Nancy really liked music, because the prison was right across the corner from us, and they ran the laundry, and they also had a prisoner's band, and the band would come out 2 and 3 times a week, and whenever Nancy would hear that band, she would just start jumping up and down and want to go and get as close to it as she could. And she was taught not to cross the street, so she would go right to the curb and stand there, keeping time with the music the whole time. Just this little bitty kid. And then we knew that she really liked music, and that's been true her whole life. So the glorious days had to come to an end, and one day Jeb came home and said he had orders for China, and that we would have to be out of the Quonset hut in approximately, well, at the most 30 days. So we had to find a place for me and Nancy to live, and that was not easy. The housing, as a result of the war, although the war was over, housing was still very, very tight. And no one wanted to rent to anyone with a child, as I found out when I started walking the streets of Vallejo, which was right near Mare Island. So we finally decided we had to go a little further out. So Jeb borrowed a car, and we toured up toward Napa, and we found this place kind of halfway, which called Napa Junction, which was really a terrible place, and I wish now that we had never ended up there, but we did. There was a motel which had been converted into living quarters, and they were very anxious to rent to anyone. So we rented it, and I didn't realize what a terrible spot it would be for me, because it was far from everything, and it was the landlord and landlady were really in violation of the law. There was some kind of rent control at that time, and they were overcharging on the rent. And the officials were trying to get the tenants to enter in a lawsuit against them, which I wasn't anxious to get involved in. But anyway, we stayed there for several months, and finally got a call. The ship was coming back to San Pedro, which is in the Long Beach area. And we were to move down there. And believe me, I wasn't sorry to make the change, except that by now Carol was on the way. And the doctor told me that it was unsafe for me. I was so near delivery time. He didn't want me to travel. And I said, well, I'm determined I'm going to. And he said, well, then I guess you'll have to travel with your records so that in case something happens along the way, you can at least have some records with you. So I had forgotten to mention that in the meantime, before Jeb left me in this desolate place, he had bought this, he'd gone to rent a car so we could take a last trip to Yosemite, and he, instead of renting it, he came home with this 35, as he called it, a pooped Plymouth, which was in terrible shape, and he reconstructed it. I mean, he redid the whole engine and everything in order to leave me with a car that was at least running. And so my brother, John, who had he'd come home from the Mediterranean part of the war in Europe and had come out and was living with me, decided that if he worked on the car a little bit, he could make it roadworthy and we could drive to San Pedro in it. And in the meantime, I had gotten a little Cocker Spaniel for Nancy because she missed her father so much after he left that when I took her to the pediatrician to see what he recommended about her being so upset, he said, well, I think you should get her a dog to take the place of her father, which I thought was rather strange, but I guess it did help some. So I had to find a place for the dog, a home for the dog, because there was no dogs allowed in the housing that Jeb was getting for us, which was another Quonset hut. So we took off, and we took 2 days going, and everything went just fine. And it was one of those real happy reunions. Jeb had the Quonset hut all fixed up with things that he'd brought from China, little lace mats and pretty china and things that made it seem real homey. And we were trying to get into, well, sort of semi-permanent housing. There were duplexes in the area that we were entitled to have while the ship was in. And but it just seemed to go on endlessly because the house had to be cleaned before we could move into it, according to the Navy rules. And so finally we said, well, if we clean it, can't we move in a little sooner? Because the baby was due any minute. In fact, she was overdue by then. And it was like I didn't want to have the baby until I had the proper place to have her have her crib and things she needed, at least a home that was homey. And we were getting all our things for the first time out of storage, which had been in storage for several years. So we cleaned this place all up and we moved in. We got our stuff out of storage, and then okay, it's time to have the baby. So so I had labor pains, and Jeb rushed me to the hospital, and I had the baby. And then because the baby was delayed and Jeb's leave was delayed, I mean, he didn't have any more leave, any more time. He was being sent to a special school, which, guess what, was in San Francisco, was at Treasure Island. So by then we had bought the car, which was the first love of his life, in cars, that is, a Lincoln Zephyr V12. And he would drive that to San Francisco. And he had to leave the day that I came home from the hospital with this brand new baby. So somehow I managed. But after, about 4 days at home, I realized that something terrible was wrong. And I thought I had appendicitis from all that I had ever heard, because Jeb had had appendicitis when he was in the Aleutians during the war. And from what he'd said of what it felt like and everything, I figured, I've got appendicitis. So in the middle of the night, I was just doubled over with pain, and the people in the other part of our duplex came to the rescue, and the wife said she would take the children. Well, the lady up the street, she would get to take Nancy, because she had a little girl her age, and she would take the baby. And her husband would take me to the hospital. So back to Bellflower, where Carol had been born. And it was a very traumatic experience. They soon determined that I had something called postpartum endometritis, which really was a terrible infection, partly because so many babies had been born the weekend that she had been born that apparently the equipment had gotten contaminated, and I had picked up this really bad infection. So every time I turned around in bed, they were punching me with penicillin again. And teams of doctors were coming through to look at me and saying, well, she's a pretty healthy specimen, I think, and looks like she probably rode a bicycle and played tennis, and she looks in pretty good shape. And I guess they were doing a study about women having babies or something, but anyway, they never cut me in on why they were so interested in me. But Jeb came home, finally, from San Francisco, and I wasn't home. He came in, and because I hadn't had any way to get any word to him, and he asked the neighbors where I was, and they said, oh, well, she's in the hospital. So he came out to see me, and with the inspiration of knowing that he was there, I got better almost immediately, and he brought me home. And then he left again. But I was on the way to being cured, and everything was fine. So from then on, at least we had very nice housing. We had our own furniture, all our own things, and a stable living condition with nice families near us. And Jeb was coming and going from the ship. He had lots of duty, but he was at least home every chance he could get. We were together. So from then on, he got orders again to the South Pacific, and we were there. But once he had gone out there, true to Navy fashion, and you never know the rhyme or reason of why they do things, they decided that he was long overdue for shore duty, which he was, and that he should have orders to Moscow, Idaho, to teach naval ROTC. So he came back, and the Navy would move all our furniture, and we would go to the university at Idaho where he could teach. And it was a harrowing trip in this Lincoln Zephyr, this V-12. And good we had it, because on the way we had an accident. And I think if we'd had a flimsy car, we might have ended up in a lot of trouble. But this was a very sturdy car, believe me. And we had gotten off of 101 in order to, because the traffic was so terrible. It was Labor Day weekend. I don't advise anybody ever to travel on Labor Day weekend. And especially having to make time and go a great distance, which we had to do. So anyway, it was on this side road, which was supposed to be more peaceful, that this little old man with a hat in the front of us slowed down for a narrow part of the highway, and all the cars bumped into each other, and the car hit us in the back, and the whole front of it was demolished. And all that happened to us was that the trunk lid didn't work well, and the front seat, Jeb's front seat, had come loose, so we had to continue the journey with sort of a floating front seat. But we finally got to Idaho, and in the meantime, we had sent Jeb's clothes separate from the housing order, the housing shipment, thinking that it would get there sooner because he would need the uniforms immediately to start teaching, and the shoes and all the equipment. Well, it got lost, and somewhere it ended up in Utah, and we arrived, and he was supposed to start teaching the following Monday, and he had no uniform, which was pretty terrible. And I can't remember exactly how he worked it out, whether they let him teach without a uniform or what, but finally the stuff arrived, and we got settled in to what Jeb called the sheep sheds. It was called Blaine Manor, and here was all this land and open space, and they had built these apartments in a circle, very close, looking right across at each other, 2 stories each, just as condensed as you could possibly get, and then you looked out and there were just acres and acres of land all around. And you began to wonder, why did they do it this way? And we thought that it was called the Palouse Empire, the waving grain. As we drove in, we thought, oh, this is such a beautiful spot. Little did we know that by the 1st of November, the snows were starting to come. We could see them on the hills, and it was getting closer and closer, and it started to snow, and it kept snowing. And that snow, from the first snow, never melted. It hadn't melted by June the following year.
Oh, no.
And it kept piling up, and until we could hardly see they shoveled the sidewalk around this circle for the houses where you could get in your doors. But in the center was this little grassy area where the children could ordinarily play, but it was full of snow because all the shoveled snow got put up there. And we would send the children out to play, and they would stand there just freezing to death. It was so cold. After Southern California, to get used to that was quite, and of course, getting the clothes that you would need to keep warm in a climate like that was quite an expense. So the budget just didn't spread very far. And for the first time in our lives, we found we had to have a charge account at the grocery store, and we found that Jeb had to get extra work. He had to shovel snow. He did other work, whatever he could get, on the weekends. And here he was, this handsome naval officer when he was all dressed up in his uniform, but on the weekends he was doing this menial labor to try to make enough money to keep us going. Because we were sending money to his mother, who we thought, really needed it, and that cut into it. And our heating bills were as much as $90 a month because it was 40 below zero most of the time. And the housing itself was quite expensive. So it was just a case of where the paycheck just wouldn't cover what we needed. So Jeb did a marvelous job of teaching, although he had an officer in charge who didn't like his style of teaching, the fact that the students just loved him and seemed to be very happy with him and gave him wonderful marks as far as an instructor. The captain, so to speak, who was in charge of all this schmear that was in Idaho at that time, was giving him all kinds of demerits. He would come in with a tape recorder and listen to his class, and Jeb had a way of always teaching with authentic sea stories. He was teaching navigation, and he would tell about ship collisions and how they happened, and it was often very hilarious, and the students would laugh, and the captain would be sitting in the back row with a tape recorder, and he'd say, "I want to see you, Lieutenant Rechen, in my office after class," and Jeb would go in and he would play him the tape recorder, the tape, and he would say, "Is that any way to teach a college level class? Having the students laughing?" And so Jeb had to admit that it certainly wasn't the captain's way of teaching, but was his way. So, but while he was there, the records for the ROTC, which had been very low, were raised considerably. In other words, the students were doing very well, and they liked him as a professor. But he got a very bad fitness report, and so instead of being there 2 years, which was probably a real blessing, We were there just 1 year. And we came back with our car, which was suffering badly from the below zero weather because we had no garage for it. In order to keep it going, we had to bring the battery in every night and drain the oil and go through a tremendous amount of trouble to just keep it running. But we started out with it loaded and coming back to California where we belonged. And about halfway, the oil pressure started to go down and the car just wasn't functioning properly. And we stopped in one place, and it happened to be in front of a Lincoln agency. And I said to Jeb, I think we should trade it in and get a new Lincoln. And he looked at me like I was crazy because I had no idea how much they cost. And that's when he began to see that I didn't know much about cars. So we managed to cripple through to San Francisco with considerable trouble along the way, but we arrived and realized that the car was literally ruined from the treatment it had in cold weather. And so we sold it and bought a Studebaker, a Skylark Coupe, a wonderful little car. And we were very happy with that, partly because the girls could be sort of locked in the back because Nancy had a way of opening doors and always wanting to get out. She didn't want to go very far at one time. She wanted to get out and run around and see what there was to see. And we had a near accident on the way to Idaho with that very thing when she had opened a back door, and I had luckily turned around and grabbed just in time to get her overalls in my hand and catch her while she was going out the door.
Yeah, because it had the suicide doors in it.
Yeah, it had the suicide doors. So anyway, we were very happy there. It was like a palatial estate. It was Navy housing, they were 8-plexes, I think. But we were on a hill and we overlooked the whole bay. And of course, to get there, you'd be very embarrassed when you ask your friends to come and see you because they went through this terrible-looking area of slaughterhouses and all kinds of odd old manufacturing centers, which really looked awful. But when you got to our living room and looked out over the bay, you'd say, "Oh, it's so beautiful." And we were very happy there until one day the orders came again, and this time they were sending Jeb to Eniwetok to bomb tests. Well, he had expressed interest in radiation, and he was always following what had gone on with the development of the bomb and all of this. So they were going to be doing bomb tests at Eniwetok, and somehow his name got on a list. I never know how or why, but anyway, he was going to leave. So what were we going to do? Again, a few days we had to be out of the housing. That was always the way. When the husband disappeared, then the family had to find another place to live. So we decided to go to Napa because I had my brother up there, and it was a quiet area with supposedly good schools. We hadn't been very happy with the schools in San Francisco. And Nancy had started kindergarten and had to be transported all the way across the city. So we rented a truck, a U-Haul, and with a neighbor helping us, we moved ourselves that time because I think the Navy wasn't going to move us that time for some reason. And found a darling little house up there to rent and ended up in Napa. Jeb got us nicely settled, and it was really pleasant, and I liked it there very much. And the girls were happy, and we got a dog, and we got a cat, the first time we'd been able to for a long time. And Carol started school, kindergarten. Nancy was by then in second grade. And we were doing really well until the landlady decided that she wanted her house back. So second time this had happened to me. And so she was evicting us. So I wrote to Jeb and said, well, I think I'm going to try to buy a house. We still have, we can get a loan on your insurance. And I had it all figured out financially how we could do it. We still had some savings bonds that had been given to us as wedding presents. And if we cashed everything we possibly had and gathered together every penny, we could make a down payment on this house. So I did all the maneuvering and got all the papers signed and settled, and I was real proud of myself. And then we had a huge rain one day, and I went down to look at the house and see how it was doing. And there happened to be a little space where you could look under the house right by the driveway. And I looked down there and I saw water. I mean, not a little water, I saw like a lake. The whole area under the house, right up to the foundation top of it, was water. And so I said, well, something has to happen about this. This is not proper and legal. And so I got the real estate man. Now all the papers were signed, and he said, well, I don't know what I can do, but he said, I'll try. And anyway, we working together and putting pressure on them, and I was calling them and telling them this was a terrible way to treat a Navy family that was having hardship of being separated and all this, and I put on a good story. And so they decided that they'd better pay to have it fixed. So they had it drained out and they had a sump pump put in. And it turned out that the reason they were selling the house was because of this drainage problem in the first place. So they knew how bad it was. So anyway, from then on, we enjoyed that house very, very much, and the girls were in school. And Jeb got home once in a while, not very much. You see, we were separated for 9 years, really. When one time I added it all up with all the sea duty, we were separated for 9 years. So I was practically raising the girls. So let's see. Where do we go from here? Oh, the next duty, the next call I got was, I think we're going to live in San Diego. Seems my ship is going to be at Coronado, and it'll be a lovely place to live. And just, I'll come home and we'll pack up everything and put most of it in storage, because we'll have furnished housing, pretty much furnished housing. And but the girls will love it. They'll be near the beach. I mean, La Jolla Shores is a gorgeous place to play on the beach. And I'll be with you, and it's just going to be wonderful. So of course I always thought it was wonderful when we were together anyway. So I thought it was great. And but however, when we started to pack and started to break up the house, it seemed like things got confused and strange. And the first thing that happened was that while Jeb was emptying a china cabinet that was a corner cupboard he had built, very lovely, on one leave when he was home, he pulled everything to the front of the cabinet, and I thought it was pretty stupid, even though I know Jeb was not stupid at all. But they had big heavy doors with glass in them, and the doors were open, and then he pulled all this china to the front of the shelf, and naturally the thing got out of balance because it wasn't nailed to the wall. And my precious, precious mustache cups, which I had treasured, they had been my grandfather Cole's mustache cups, which I had carried with us all this time, fell on the floor and broke. Well, that was, kind of off to a bad start. But we did finally get everything in the hands of the Navy. We were packing up this stuff so we'd be sure it was carefully packed. We didn't trust the Navy. So we had a fairly decent trip down there, but again, money was short because with travel, everything costs more than you think it will. And So we tried to find a motel for the first night because we knew we couldn't get into this housing right away, and we knew we had to stay in a motel for a couple of days anyway. So every place we would go to look at a motel, I would decide that it was too expensive, that surely they were charging too much. They shouldn't charge that much. We finally found a place, and it was fairly reasonable. And then we were just about to park the car and sign up for it, and the woman stuck her head out the door and said, "If you use the kitchen, it'll be $5 more." And I said, "That's it, Jeb. We're not taking it. No way." So we drove off. By then, everybody was getting really exasperated with Mama. So we drove way to the back of San Diego toward the east, and we found a motel, which was much cheaper. But by then, tempers were really, really short. And that is the one night that Daddy spanked Mommy. And the girls will never forget that. Because he said that I was completely unreasonable, and he put me over his knee, and he didn't spank me very hard, but he did spank me. It was very embarrassing. And he said, "Now, you all sit down, behave yourselves, and I'm going out and buy us some Kentucky Fried Chicken." We were all starving to death. And he said, "I'll be back with our dinner." So he really took over. Well, we stayed there that night, and turns out the housing was going to be available sooner than we thought. We'd made a phone call, and they said that we could move in that day. So this was like a sixplex, I think. And it was surrounded with grass and trees, and it was lovely. It was called Cyan Village, and the school was right near. And it was very pleasant. And but on the way to there, I've forgotten to say we had taken our cat with us from Napa. And because the girls, Nancy was very attached to cats. Any animal we ever had, she was very attached to. So we had brought this cat with us. And we had it in the motel, even though it was sort of illegal to have it in the motel. And for some reason, when we left the motel, nobody thought about the cat. So we knew the cat was in the motel. So we get halfway back into San Diego, and the children said, "Where's the cat? we left the cat." And so panic. And so Jeb turns around, and we go back, and there's the cat. The maid was already cleaning up the room with a vacuum, and the cat was huddled under the bed, scared to death. So we rescued the cat and went back. And that cat, I don't think, ever was the same again. We called it Frady Cat. I was scared of everything. But anyway, we had lovely, lovely times at Cyan Village, and Jeb would commute to Coronado. But it was there that he decided that if he ever had a job, that he would live close to the job because the commuting was terrible. He had to go by ferry, and of course, right in the early morning traffic and coming home traffic, it was bad. So he was pretty unhappy with the commuting. So let me see, where did we go from there? We, of course, the ship was going to go out again, and by then we were getting pretty restive with the Navy. The peacetime Navy was completely different, and Jeb wasn't happy, and he really wanted to think of another career, of getting out. But he didn't want to leave until he really felt it was right to him and to the people that he was resigning to. And he had this real conviction that there's a right time to do everything. And finally, from Hawaii, he wrote to me, and his next orders, by the way, were going to be for us to go to Hawaii, which I thought might be kind of nice. But he said he thought the time had come that he should get out of the Navy, and this was, by then it was 1955, and so he said we would look for a place. Well, I told him that I would be glad to work and help him get through school, since he'd put me through school. and that we would find the right place for him to go to school, and we would make our lives work. There was no question, but we knew we could make it work. Although all our friends said, you're crazy to leave, because he didn't have the 20 years for the retirement. He was leaving the Navy without a retirement after putting in all these years. And because they didn't count the academy time as part of a retirement. So he was short by probably 3 or 4 years, I can't remember exactly what, of getting a 20-year retirement. But he was determined, he was age 35, that if he didn't go back to school and change careers at that point, that it just wouldn't work. So I was right with him, and I said, good. His mother was having 10 fits. She was saying, he'll never be anything, he'll never amount to anything. It's all going to be failure, you're all going to be sorry, you should stay in the Navy, and blah, blah, blah. So, but we decided we knew what was best for us, so we did it. And then we started looking around for schools. So he decided Albuquerque, University of New Mexico, would be a good place to go because Sandia Corporation was there, and his idea was that he could go to school and then work some in the related physics, which is what he wanted to study. And so we bought a very expensive tailor-made suit because we wanted him to look so nice. And he took a plane down to Albuquerque, and he looked it all over, talked with everybody. And I was, of course, waiting on pins and needles to see when he came. I met the plane when he came back and asked him, oh, how was it, what happened? And he said, Meda, he said, I'm not taking my ladies down there. He said, I found out what that enchantment on the license plate means. It means sand, and it's blowing. And he said, it's miserable, and I'm not taking you there. You wouldn't like it. So I said, okay, well, what's next then? He said, well, I'm going to try at Stanford. So we corresponded with Stanford and phoned and everything, and we found out how expensive that was. And I said, no way can we afford that. So we tootled up the line, and guess what? We stopped in Berkeley, the greatest university in the whole world. And would he dare apply there? Well, of course, why not? So we drove down the Shattuck Avenue of Berkeley, and Jeb said, greatest university in the world, and it just looks like any other small town in America. I can't understand it. It's very ordinary here. And so we decided that this was it, and we would go through all that we had to go. We had some. They had a special name for what a small amount of money that they gave you as a release from the Navy. If you weren't having a retirement, you could get this money in lieu of that. It was a few $1,000s. And so we had a down payment for a house, and we figured that was the best thing to do, was buy a house as soon as we could. And my idea was that we would buy it near the campus, and we would rent rooms to students. And I would work, and that way we could really make it work. So we did just that. We went in to get a loan. We found this house, a big brown shingle house in Fulton and Derby. And we talked with the loan officer, and he said, well, what is your income? And Jeb said, well, I'm going to be a student. And he looked at me, and what is your income? Well, I'm going to get a job. He said, but you have nothing now? No financial income? And we said, no, not yet, but, we'll work that out. And he said, well, I can't give you a loan. He said, you're just very poor prospects for 2 children. The darling little blonde-headed girl sitting there smiling at him. And the manager of the bank, the bigwig, came out the door about then, and he said, he turned to him and he said, these people want a loan and they have no income. And he said, he looked at us, he talked with Jeb for a few minutes and asked him what he was going to major in, and he said physics and so on. And he said, I'll give him the loan. So things like that always happened to Jeb. I mean, we'd be in a tight squeeze and it would always work out. So while the people were getting out of the house, because they had to move 2 darling little old spinster ladies who had decided Berkeley wasn't for them anymore. It was getting too rowdy and political and
Mhm.
so on. They were going to move to the stable suburbs. We were going to stay with my brother John up in Napa, and Jeb was going to rent a room and start school in summer session. And this was May 5/5/55. So he looked at rooms, and that's when we began to realize how terrible the rooms that were for rent in Berkeley were. And we thought, boy, we're going to have nice rooms for students, and we'll, really do well with our rentals. Luckily, we had a friend, an old Navy shipmate of Jeb's, who lived in the area, and we looked them up, and they said, "Oh, Jeb, they already had 3 or 4 children, I can't remember. You can stay with us, no problem. And then you can go home on weekends." I was living with my brother John in their garage, and the girls were going to school up there. So finally the house was vacated by these spinster ladies, and we moved in, and our furniture all came. Everything we owned was finally together, and it was the happiest time of our life. We knew we were out of the Navy. We were our own free agents. The girls said, "Mom, you mean we're not going to move anymore?" And Nancy said, and I said, "No, we're not." She said, "Well, then I'm going to make some friends." And she did. And she wanted them all to come and visit. And I never will forget her first birthday party in that house was August. We moved in June. And she came home and said, "I'm going to have a big party. I'm going to invite my friends." And we said, "Well, okay." And she said she'd manage the whole thing. She was going to make popcorn, and they were going to play games. And so the car started driving up from school. I'm looking the house over and everything. And there wasn't one Caucasian in the bunch. There were lots of black children. There were Oriental children, Japanese, Chinese, you name it. And she was so proud. "These are all my friends, Mom." And they came in, and they had a wonderful time, and she just made a wonderful party. It was like she was celebrating being out of the Navy and everything she hadn't liked about it. So Jeb was very busy in school, and in order to make ends meet, he was doing tutoring right around this table that I'm sitting at now. He could tutor NROTC subjects, which he knew very well, like navigation and, I don't know what all, but so he got money for that. I rented rooms, and we had lovely students, really. We had a few real pills that we didn't like, but we got rid of them finally. And we had one girl named Claire Hendrickson who was just like a big sister to our girls. She'd been an only child, and she loved our girls so much, and she wanted to teach them and share everything with them. She taught them how to play tennis, and she told Nancy that she was musical and that she should have a piano, and she talked us into renting a piano, which we could hardly afford, but we did. And she started in singing and learning how to play the piano and just being happy. And Carol started playing the cello at school, and we were just so happy. We could hardly drive our car at all because our budget was very limited. We didn't take a newspaper. We didn't subscribe to any magazines. But Jeb was in school, and he was learning, and knew that he was in the bright field that he really dearly loved. And although he had to take many more undergraduate classes than he thought he would, because they didn't consider the Naval Academy A+1, number 1 school, he found out. So, you want me to stop now?
I'll go on for 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Because the tape's about to run out.
So, those years went by very quickly, and the girls grew up. They went to Berkeley High. They did very well. They both got accepted in UC Davis with no trouble at all. And Nancy majored in biological sciences, and Carol majored in, she was going to major in landscape architecture, but she decided there was such a smorgasbord of art classes and good art teachers that she wanted to go for straight art, and so she did. And with our blessing, even though Jeb had wanted one of them to be a physicist, he couldn't manage to do that. So they were very happy, and it was at Davis that Nancy met her wonderful husband, John Malin, in a musical that they were participating in. And Carol met
It was showroom, right?
I think it was the Mikado. No, I'm not sure. I think it was Showboat.
Yeah, they did the Mikado later.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, when Nancy brought John home, Jeb's comment was, "That's the first real man that she's ever brought home." And he liked John right away. And so John made many a trip up and down and during the courtship. When Nancy was, well, and then when Nancy graduated, she took a internship at Kaiser Hospital to get her medical technology certificates, and they were married and went to Stanford, where John had a postdoc. Carol had had a romance with a young man and had her wedding date all set, and because the parents were being very possessive and very bossy with them, and things just weren't going well, they suddenly split up, and Carol was left on her own with no boyfriend or anything. And that's when Eberhard came into the picture. And that is a complete interesting story, which I don't know if I have time for. But Eberhard was invited for lunch to meet a girl that I knew who needed a boyfriend, not Carol. Carol was at Davis. And we were having lunch, and Carol turned up very unexpectedly, because she had happened to get a ride down with a couple of guys who were coming to Berkeley and going right back. And she walks in, and I guess it was kind of love at first sight with them. They were both on the rebound from a romance, and they liked each other, but they had this other girl. And Eberhard was supposed to take her out that night on a date, the one I had set him up with. So they all three went out, but in the early evening, they dumped the other girl. And Carol and Eberhard, I guess, realized that they really were attracted to each other. And so she slipped Eberhard in on the very day that she was supposed to marry this other guy. And that was horrendous. A quick wedding. But they were married at the Lutheran Theological Seminary. And that was a gala week with John getting a PhD at Davis, and Nancy had graduated from, well, Carol had graduated from Davis. It was Father's Day thrown in there for one thing, and Carol's birthday for another. I mean, it was just like it was a bonanza of everything happened that one weekend. And so that brings us up through the girls' marriages. And maybe that's enough.